Deputy Speaker. Thanks, Mr Deputy Speaker, for this opportunity to address the Lieutenant Governor's address to the other place. I've seen a few Governor's addresses over the years, and it is, I have to say, far more pleasurable to hear one delivered that outlines the Labor program. It's obviously very nice when you hear the agenda for the next 4 years of government being outlined and focusing on the things which you've come in also to actually try and address. As everyone knows, I was a late starter on the last election campaign, but some of the reasons why I decided to do that were actually outlined by in the Governor's address. The address talked about education being a first-order priority, and I'd endorse many of the member for Camden's sentiments as she outlined in her recent speech, apart perhaps from the one where she thinks that everybody should want to live in Camden, because obviously Queanbeyan and the southeast is the place where the preference would be. The speech outlined the government's commitments, particularly around teachers, and the thing that I wanted to highlight about that is that all service provision is about more than just buildings, and it tends to be forgotten sometimes when we see big cheques being presented, big announcements of capital programs, and indeed there's certainly some of those capital programs that I outlined for Monaro, and which will come as a result of the agenda that was outlined in the Governor's speech. But staffing those facilities is obviously the absolute key as we go through. The teacher attrition, which the member for Camden was talking about, the shortages of teachers is one of the key reasons why I decided to run. I was hearing virtually every day from people about children being in the playground for hours on end because there was teacher shortages affecting the classes. Now, to be fair, those are still going on because it does take time to address some of those, and I'm certainly getting feedback from some of the local high schools about multiple classes now in the halls because it's too cold really to be in the playgrounds. And from the leadership of our schools just trying every day to deal with replacing the teachers who are away, with replacing the teachers who they can't actually recruit. And in our region particularly, a really difficult cross-border issue because we do, Monaro and some of the neighbouring electorates do bound to the ACT, and the ACT's offering for teachers is something which can be attractive to some of them. So it's a real challenge for our region. And one of the reasons why the ACT's offering for teachers in terms of salaries is more attractive is because of the ridiculous 2.5% wage cap which the previous government insisted on for public sector workers, seeing them fall more and more behind in real terms against inflation in Australia, and making many other occupations, particularly in our region, more attractive. So we've consistently seen teachers who've left teaching in New South Wales for a number of reasons. Firstly, inability to get permanency. Secondly, more attractive working hours and working conditions in, say, the public service in Canberra or in the ACT teaching service. And thirdly, the massive workloads which they were being expected to deal with because of the shortage of teachers. So very much a self-fulfilling issue or circular issue where one problem was compounding another and causing it. So I was really thrilled to hear the Lieutenant Governor confirming some of the policies which we took to the election, particularly around converting temporary teachers into permanent teachers. We've said that we will convert 16,000 teachers and school staff from temporary positions into permanent. And I have to say I've been really gratified by the rapid progress that's been made on that. And we've heard the Minister for Education and Deputy Premier standing in this place in question time since then, talking about the fact that already, just 3 months into this government, 6,000 teachers have actually taken up those permanent positions. That is phenomenal, and I have to say that I don't think anybody in their wildest dreams could have expected that our progress on that would be so quick. But what it reflects is a government that is committed to implementing its policies. It's committed to implementing the things that we committed to the people of New South Wales, and the fact that this was so needed. the fact that people have taken it up so fast. And even today in question time, the Minister of Education was reading a letter from somebody who was talking about some of these issues. It's something which is very close to home for me. My daughter is a teacher at our local high school, indeed the high school that she went to school at. She spent 3 years or so as a temporary teacher. She managed to get permanency before the election, which is great, but she was certainly considering, as she looked at her life as a newly married person and with a mortgage, her and her husband, at whether or not that temporary job that she had offered the conditions that they needed for their lives. Incidentally, my son-in-law embarked on an apprenticeship not so long ago, so many of the issues which we have been hearing about access to apprenticeships and assistance for apprentices have also been very relevant in our lives. But of course it's about our whole electorate, and when I visit other high schools, other primary schools around the Monaro electorate, I hear consistently that the teacher shortage is the number one problem that they're facing. The material which we saw in the Governor's speech and others tells us that there was projected to be a shortfall of some 4,100 high school teachers by 2025, and it's a situation that none of us who are committed to public education could, in any good conscience, allow to continue. We also need to see that investment in vocational education. I've heard some terrific stories about the work that high schools in our region are doing with vet courses and with linking with employers. And in fact, I was hearing just the other day when I looked at where I toured the Snowy 2.0 project, which is a topic probably for another day, but which is a very interesting project, about the strong links that the contractors and the proponents of that project had made with Monaro High School in terms of vet courses and students who were coming across and able to undertake training in the concrete casting facilities in Cooma. It's great to see that sort of industry educational link, but one of the things which has really held back our vocational training in Monaro over the last decade has been the wind back in TAFE facilities and in the usage of TAFE facilities. We have fabulous facilities in Cooma, for example, a fully commercial kitchen at the Cooma TAFE, which incidentally was built last time I was the local member, along with one in Jindabyne, but which it's still standing, but vastly underutilised because the funding just hasn't been there into TAFE for those vocational courses which we needed to see. And you know, anybody would say that Cooma and Jindabyne, as the heart of an economy which is driven in a large part by hospitality, needs to have those programs running. And so I'm looking forward to this government's commitment on TAFE coming through and benefiting our area. In health, we've talked again about the incredible challenge we have in making the wages in health competitive with the need to retain those workers in the system. I've recently spoken in this place about the fabulous work that Queanbeyan Hospital and their maternity department does, but I'm aware that that in that area and in Cooma and our other hospitals and smaller facilities around Monaro, there is massive problems in engaging in getting a workforce, to the point where our local health district has just spent some time in England and Ireland in actually directly going there and recruiting people to come to our region to work. And I hope that's going to help to alleviate some of the issues, but it won't alleviate all. During the election campaign, I made some commitments to Bombala on the health and aged care area, which will be delivered by this government, which are very important. In Bombala, the reopening of the Caruana, which used to be a nursing home but is going to reopen as a supported accommodation facility for elderly people, for people who can't live at home, is a really important community-driven project, one where the community has raised on its own a couple of $100,000 or more to actually get this open, and where Labor will contribute $840,000 to helping that along the way. That'll combine with an expansion to the Bombala MPS, Bombala Hospital, which will which will bring new aged care beds in, and I acknowledge that the previous government was working on this project as well, and indeed had done the scope for it and the studies for it. But it was held up because of, as we went into election campaign, the ridiculous need for the previous government to challenge federal Labor on things and say, well, we'll only do this if you cough up money, but doing that by press release rather than by constructive discussion. And one of the things that the people of Monaro are able to expect and will receive over the next 4 years is that when I work with our fabulous federal member, Christy McBain, it'll be by talking to her first and by actually working with her on these issues rather than trying to make it a political point-scoring exercise, which actually holds things up for our communities rather than moving them along. The other area of health that I just wanted to highlight briefly in this is that the previous government did announce a large amount of funding for Jindabyne for a SAP program, Special Activation Precinct. Now, I have some concerns about that because a number of the things in that seem to me to take a fairly paternalistic approach. The previous member essentially said this is going to happen, and the community's been told what's going to happen rather than listening to some of that feedback. And one of the critical flaws that I've found in that, which I was frankly blown away about, was that in planning for a very large increase in population for Jindabyne, no one had spoken to health about the need for health services to actually go along with that and expand and plan to cope with that. That's something which I'm seeking to rectify at the moment. It's something which is absolutely vital for that region. Housing was one of the things which the Lieutenant Government talked about a lot, and when I was last the local member, housing was an issue in Queanbeyan, not so much in other centres. Now it's an issue in every centre in the Monaro electorate. I'm working with groups like Carabar Housing, who's a community housing provider, but we need to do a whole lot in all areas of housing, social housing, key worker accommodation and in affordable housing. And there's a number of projects which I'll be seeking to push along, and I very much welcome the announcement just this week or last week, I think, by the federal government of $2 billion going into social housing, and I will certainly be lobbying to get our fair share of that in Monaro, to see if we can work on some of the housing crisis touch points around Queanbeyan and Cooma. Cooma particularly is at the moment overwhelmed with the workforce that's come in from Snowy 2.0, and that's meant that while that's been difficult to house, that's made life even more difficult for people who are on the edge of being able to afford housing. And when I was campaigning for the election, I was hearing stories of women in their 50s who were sleeping in their cars, and really that's a pretty frightening prospect when you're getting down to -7 or 8 at night. It's something that we have to address. The Lieutenant Governor's speech talked about climate policy. Mr. Speaker, I might seek an extension of time.
The question is that an extension of time is requested. All those who say aye, contrary no, the ayes have it, the ayes have it.
Very riveting.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. The Lieutenant Governor's address talked about this government's approach to climate policy, and that's something which again was a strong focus for me, and has actually been in the years that I've spent out of politics. Obviously in the Monaro electorate with the ski, with the alpine areas, with the incredibly valuable Kosciuszko National Park, we have an environment there which has formed over millions of years as Australia's alpine area. Now, even over my lifetime and even over my visits to the snow over many years growing up in the area, and those that I still hope to be making in the next few weeks, I've seen the reduction in the snow which is falling. I've seen the snow line getting higher, and that obviously has serious impacts for much of the alpine flora and fauna. It's something which we need to be taking seriously, and it's one of the reasons why, if you visit the snow, you'll see that the resorts and many of people in the snow are an active part of campaigning for climate action, because they can see on their doorstep the impact that climate change is having. Now, over the last number of years, I've also worked in the irrigation sector, and in rural New South Wales, and seen a lot of the work that's gone on about predicting the impacts of climate there. And in the Murray-Darling Basin, for example, CSIRO predicts that climate change is going to result in a 20% reduction in runoff. So, in other words, the amount of water which gets from the land when the rain's fallen into our rivers. That's something which has a really serious impact for the environment, but also for our productive capacity in growing the food that the people of Australia need and that we export to the world. It's something that needs to be addressed with continuing work on efficiency in production, but also in implementation of planning to work out which of those vulnerable areas of things like wetlands we can actually ensure that we save, and what the methods are that we do that. Because climate change, you can't isolate the impacts of it to one part of a river system. You can't say, well, we're going to protect be able to save all the wetlands in the system if your water levels are unlikely to get to the levels that inundate those, because the natural rainfall and runoff has reduced by so much. On the same token, we need to make sure that we are continuing to be an efficient and productive state in producing our food and the healthy fruit and vegetables. 80-odd% of many of our fruit and vegetables that we consume in New South Wales actually come from irrigated product. So it's a really difficult balance, and one I'd certainly like to talk about in more detail as we go through this term. The Lieutenant Governor's speech also talked a lot about the government's Made in New South Wales policy, and we hear a lot about that, of course, in things like trains, where when you visit Melbourne, for example, you see very proudly on the sides of their trains, made in Victoria. In New South Wales, we see made in South Korea, but sitting there idle for 4 years because of the mess that the previous government made of those purchases and not having the faith in New South Wales manufacturers to do it. But I want to talk a bit about some of the other aspects of Made in New South Wales, because there's huge opportunities for our rural and regional areas in New South Wales to actually be producing more for export, to be doing more of the manufacturing and stage production of our product from our farming sector. So looking at how we can actually work with our primary industry sector to further process their product before it goes to market, further process product before it's exported, but also looking at the feed-in for those sectors. Those sectors have a huge demand for machinery and things like fertilisers and so on, many of which are produced overseas. Fertilisers, for example, were in serious short supply over the last few years, exacerbated by the COVID and by the trade disruptions that we had, but also by issues around energy costs, because many of them are high energy users to produce. And those are the sort of things which positive, constructive government will look at over time. So, for example, when we're looking at a strategy for in our energy sector, part of that can talk about how those energy needs and the production of hydrogen, for example, then feed into our fertiliser manufacturing, because we are extremely dependent on foreign sources for that. And when we see, for example, trade relationships break down with China or any other country, we can be really seriously negatively affected by that. So I'd look forward to being able to give that sort of input into this government over the next 4 years, which talks about how we can try to play our part in becoming more self-sufficient in that, and in reducing our reliance on imports, but also then making more of our primary product able to be exported in a way which generates more jobs in rural and regional areas. Rural and regional areas shouldn't be afraid of the transition to net zero. There is huge opportunities for our sectors in that. I've spent a bit of time involved in things like the renewables and agriculture. That conference was actually on yesterday. I wasn't able to attend it in Dubbo, unfortunately, but there is great opportunities for farmers, firstly in hosting renewables and still being able to conduct farming activities, as well as in making the transition and making themselves a more attractive product for retailers as they tell consumers about their carbon impact.